On a quiet stretch of Indiana farmland, there once stood a Methodist church so respected that parents entrusted it with their most precious treasure, their children. Every Sunday morning, 50 small hands waved goodbye at the church steps, lunch pails swinging, hymn books tucked under arms, and over the course of 2 years, those children never came home. No screams were heard, no alarms were raised, no graves were marked. What followed was not a frantic search, but a collective decision to forget. Tonight, you will step into the most chilling religious crime ever buried in American history, a story not of monsters in shadows, but of faith, obedience, and an entire community that chose silence over salvation. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Cedar Creek Methodist Church did not look like a place where evil could take root, and perhaps that was its greatest protection. It stood on a gentle rise at the edge of town, framed by elm trees that whispered softly whenever the Indiana wind passed through them, their leaves brushing together like quiet prayers. The church had been there longer than most of the homes surrounding it, its foundation stones laid by hands that believed faith could tame the wilderness, that scripture could civilize fear. Its whitewashed walls gleamed in the morning sun, and every Sunday the bell rang with a steady confidence that echoed across fields and dirt roads, calling families from miles away. To the people of Cedar Creek, that sound meant safety, it meant order. It meant that no matter how hard life became, there was a place where things still made sense. Parents dressed their children in clean clothes, smoothed their hair, and watched them walk up the stone steps without hesitation, because the church was not merely trusted, it was unquestionable. By the 1870s, Sunday school had become the heart of that trust, advertised as a sacred duty rather than a choice, a place where children would be shaped into obedient souls under God's watchful eye. Ministers spoke of discipline as love, of obedience as virtue, and of sacrifice as a necessary step towards salvation, and no one thought to ask where the line between guidance and control truly lay. Attendance records from those early years show classrooms filled with eager names, written carefully in ink by teachers who believed they were serving a holy purpose. Yet hidden within those same ledgers, patterns began to form, subtle at first, easy to miss. A child marked absent 1 week, gone entirely the next. A name quietly crossed out, replaced by another. Parents were told their son had been selected for advanced instruction, that their daughter had been offered an opportunity elsewhere through church connections. These explanations were delivered calmly, with authority, and authority in Cedar Creek was never challenged. To question the church was to question God's will, and so doubts were swallowed, unease buried beneath sermons about humility and trust. The town had been shaped by hardship, failed harvests, illness, sudden deaths, and faith had always been the language through which suffering was explained. If a child disappeared, it was said to be part of a divine plan, one beyond human understanding. Over time, disappearances became part of the background noise of life, spaced carefully enough to avoid panic, dispersed across families who lacked influence, whose grief carried little weight beyond their own walls. No posters were raised, no town meetings were called. Instead, there were quiet reassurances, firm smiles, and reminders that the church knew best. Beneath the sanctuary floor, beneath the hymns and polished sermons, the basement doors remained closed more often than not, their keys kept by men who spoke softly and moved with purpose. Children were occasionally escorted away after class, told the why had been chosen, that they were special, that God had work for them beyond the classroom. Some returned pale and silent, others did not return at all. Still, the congregation sang, still the bell rang, still parents convinced themselves that faith demanded surrender, even when that surrender felt like loss. And so, without a single scream echoing through the streets, without a single alarm bell ringing in protest, Cedar Creek Methodist Church became the place where children went to be seen for the last time, and where an entire town learned how easy it was to look away. As the seasons turned and Cedar Creek settled deeper into its routines, The church's authority did not weaken with the quiet losses. It hardened, like clay fired again and again until it could no longer be reshaped. The ministers spoke more often of vigilance and purity, of guarding young souls from the corruptions of the outside world, and these sermons landed softly on ears already trained to agree, because fear, when wrapped in Scripture, sounds like wisdom. New rules appeared. Without announcement, parents were encouraged to leave their children longer after Sunday lessons so teachers could offer special guidance. Certain classes were reorganized by age and temperament, and a rotating schedule was introduced that sent selected children to private instruction in unused rooms, spaces that existed beyond the familiar rhythm of hymn and prayer. No one noticed how carefully those selections were made, how children with few relatives or those from struggling households were favored, how the same families were reassured again and again that their child's absence was temporary, beneficial, ordained. The town's elders repeated the church's words until they sounded like common sense, and soon it became impolite, almost sinful, to question why the Sunday school rolls grew thinner, even as enrollment supposedly expanded. At the center of this tightening system stood men who understood not only faith, but people, how guilt could be cultivated, how gratitude could be weaponized, how silence could be made to feel like devotion. Teachers were rotated frequently, praised for obedience rather than curiosity, and those who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned, their concerns reframed as personal weakness. The church basement, once a storage space for old pews and winter coal, was renovated under the pretense of expansion, its entrance moved, its windows boarded, its corridors partitioned into rooms that swallowed sound. Workmen were sworn to discretion, paid through church funds and prayerful handshakes, told they were serving a higher purpose. Above ground, the sermons grew warmer, more communal, emphasizing charity drives and fellowship meals that kept the congregation busy, bonded, distracted. Beneath that surface, a structure took shape that relied on routine to conceal rupture, on repetition to dull alarm. Children learned quickly that obedience earned approval and that questions brought consequences. Subtle at first, missed meals, stern lectures, but enough to teach compliance. Those who returned from private instruction spoke less, their eyes carrying a weight they did not have words for, and parents mistook this quiet for maturity, for spiritual growth. Letters began to circulate between church leaders and neighboring towns, framed as outreach, requesting assistance for relocated wards, language that blurred responsibility until no single place felt accountable. When a mother wept too loudly or a father pressed too hard, they were invited into the minister's office, where compassion was dispensed alongside admonition, where grief was redirected into prayer, and doubt was named a test of faith. The community learned, without ever being told outright, that harmony depended on acceptance, and acceptance depended on not seeing too clearly. Even the bell seemed to change its voice, ringing with a heavier tone that marked time rather than welcome, measuring sun, days not by joy but by inevitability. By the late 1870s, rumors had begun to surface beyond Cedar Creek, whispers carried by traders and travelers who noticed children vanish into the town and not reappear. But rumors die quickly when they meet polite smiles and orderly streets. The church's reputation shielded it like armor, polished by decades of charity and ceremony, and the town's collective will to believe did the rest. It was during this period, when the machinery of silence ran most smoothly, that a substitute teacher arrived, unconnected enough to notice the gaps, observant enough to feel the wrongness that clung to the halls like cold air. She would later say that the church felt watchful, not welcoming, that the walls seemed to listen. At first her concerns were small and easily dismissed, a locked door where one should not be, a lesson plan that skipped names without explanation, but small concerns, when stacked carefully, become a pattern, and patterns once seen refuse to be unseen. Yet even as she began to sense the truth moving beneath her feet, the town continued its rituals, unaware or unwilling to admit that faith had been repurposed into a system that fed on trust, and that every quiet Sunday carried the weight of children who never made it home. The substitute teacher, Ellen Hartwell, moved through Cedar Creek's church with the careful politeness of a guest who knew she was being watched, yet the longer she stayed, the more the building revealed itself in small betrayals of normalcy, in details that refused to align no matter how she adjusted her expectations, because absence has a way of announcing itself even when everyone else pretends it is not there. She noticed how attendance books were meticulously kept yet strangely amended, names penciled in and erased, dates shifted, margins crowded with neat annotations that explained everything and nothing at once, and she noticed how the children who remained learned the rhythms of obedience faster than curiosity, how they sat with hands folded and eyes lowered as if attention itself were dangerous. Ellen had come to Cedar Creek after the illness of the regular teacher, expecting a quiet assignment, a temporary stewardship of lessons already written. But from her first Sunday she sensed the air of caution that hung over the classrooms, the way senior teachers exchanged glances before answering simple questions, the way laughter cut short when footsteps approached. She began to ask gently about the missing students, phrasing her concern in the language of care rather than accusation, and was met with rehearsed explanations that slid past her like oil, stories of children sent to relatives, of families moving west, of private instruction better suited to delicate souls. Each answer came with a smile and a verse, and each left behind a residue of doubt that settled in her chest and refused to clear. During her second week, she was asked to supervise a group while another teacher took selected children downstairs for special lessons, and it was then that Ellen first felt the wrongness sharpen into something almost physical, because the children chosen did not share a common age or ability, only a common stillness, and as they followed their guide, they did not chatter or complain, but walked with the resigned quiet of those who have learned that resistance only prolongs the inevitable. Ellen waited for their return longer than expected, the minutes stretching into an hour, and when she finally inquired, she was told, gently but firmly, that she should focus on her duties above, that curiosity was understandable but unnecessary. That night, unable to sleep, she replayed the day in her mind and realized that no one could recall exactly when the private lessons had been introduced or by whom, only that they were now an unquestioned part of the program, defended by tradition that seemed to appear fully formed rather than grow. The following Sunday, Ellen arrived early under the pretense of preparation and wandered the corridors, listening to the building breathe, and found doors she had not seen before, their hinges new, their locks polished, their placement subtly altered, so that hallways bent away from them rather than toward. She touched one handle and felt the cool resistance of iron, and in that moment she understood that whatever lay beyond was meant to be inaccessible, not just physically but socially, sealed off by consensus. Still, she persisted, collecting details the way one gathers kindling, small and dry, and easily dismissed on their own, but dangerous when brought together. She noticed deliveries marked as supplies that never appeared upstairs, smelled faint traces of chemicals where there should have been dust and wood, and heard sounds from below, muffled, irregular, that could not be explained by prayer or instruction. When she shared her unease with a senior teacher she trusted, the woman's face tightened with a fear that confirmed everything, and she whispered that some truths were too heavy to carry alone, that the church had its ways and those ways demanded loyalty. Ellen began to keep a private journal, recording dates, names, impressions, aware that memory alone could be reshaped by pressure, and as the pages filled she saw the outline of a system designed to erase children not in chaos but in order, to move them quietly from visibility to absence under the shelter of faith. Her breaking point came when a small boy failed to return from a private lesson, and his mother arrived after service, frantic and pale, only to be ushered into an office where her grief was absorbed and redirected, until she left quieter than she had come, convinced she had been given an answer when she had not. Ellen followed the mother's path after hours, slipping through a side door left unlatched, and descended the narrow staircase that led to the basement. each step amplifying her resolve and her fear, until the air changed and the light thinned, and she found herself standing at the threshold of a space that should not have existed, partitioned rooms stretching deeper than the church's footprint allowed, walls newly built yet already stained, and in that moment the rumors, the missing names, the silences aligned into a truth so stark it stole her breath. She did not explore far because discovery would have meant disappearance, but she saw enough to know that Cedar Creek's evil was not accidental or momentary, but sustained, curated, protected by those who believed that righteousness justified any cost. When she emerged, heart pounding, Ellen understood that knowledge alone was a liability, that to survive she would need allies or evidence or both. And as she stepped back into the sunlight of a town going about its business, she realized with a chilling clarity that the greatest danger was not the cruelty hidden below, but the calm above, the collective agreement to look away, because breaking that agreement would demand a reckoning Cedar Creek had been avoiding for years, and she was now, whether she wished it or not, standing at the edge of that reckoning. Ellen did not return home immediately after that descent into the basement, because the knowledge she carried felt volatile, as if setting it down too quickly would cause it to detonate. So she walked instead along the dirt road that skirted the edge of Cedar Creek, letting the ordinary sounds of evening, the lowing of cattle, the clatter of a distant wagon, the murmur of voices drifting from porches, press against her senses and remind her that the world above still functioned, still believed in itself, even as something monstrous operated beneath its rituals. And as she walked, she understood that whatever she did next could not be impulsive, because the church had survived by anticipating outrage and neutralizing it before it could take shape. Over the following weeks, she learned to perform normalcy with greater care, to smile at sermons, and repeat B. Urses while her mind worked tirelessly beneath the surface, mapping relationships, identifying who benefited most from the system and who merely complied out of fear or convenience, and she began to see that the disappearances were not random but targeted, that children from families with limited means or social standing vanished more easily, their absence explained away by poverty's mobility, while those from respected households were spared, protected by innocence, but by visibility. Ellen expanded her journal into something closer to an archive, copying attendance lists, noting changes in staff assignments, recording overheard conversations that revealed anxieties slipping through carefully maintained composure, and she realized with a grim clarity that the church's leadership rotated responsibility in a way that diffused blame, so no single person could be accused without implicating everyone else. A structure that made exposure not just dangerous but destabilizing to the entire community. When she attempted to confide in the town's doctor, a man known for discretion, she was met with a silence that stretched too long before he advised her gently to leave Cedar Creek while she could, warning that the town had ways of protecting its own that extended beyond law or reason, and that advice confirmed her fear that formal authority had already been absorbed, that any appeal to institutions would be intercepted long before it reached sympathetic ears. Small acts of intimidation followed, subtle enough to be denied but persistent enough to be unmistakable. Her room searched while she attended service. Her journal shifted slightly from where she left it, anonymous notes reminding her of her temporary status and the ease with which it could be made permanent elsewhere. And through it all, the church maintained its benevolent facade, hosting picnics and charity drives that reinforced its image as the town's moral center. Ellen began to understand that exposure would require proof so undeniable it could not be dismissed as hysteria, and that proof would have to come from within the very space designed to conceal it. So she devised a plan that balanced patience with urgency, waiting for a night when the church would be occupied by a long meeting that drew attention above, while leaving the basement less guarded, and she enlisted the reluctant help of a young groundskeeper whose brother had vanished years earlier under circumstances eerily similar to those she now recognized, appealing not to his anger, but to his grief, to the wound that had never closed because it had never been acknowledged. On the chosen night, as hymns echoed through the sanctuary, Ellen and the groundskeeper slipped through a service entrance and descended once more, this time carrying a lantern and a resolve sharpened by the knowledge that retreat would not restore ignorance. And as they moved deeper, they discovered records meticulously kept, ledgers that tracked children not as souls but as resources, coded entries that suggested transfers and payments, and in one room a series of locked cabinets whose contents hinted at a scale of operation far beyond what Ellen had imagined, implicating not just Cedar Creek but neighboring towns whose leaders had looked the other way in exchange for favors. They worked quickly, copying what they could, their hands shaking not from fear but from the weight of confirmation, and when footsteps sounded above they extinguished the lantern and hid, pressed into darkness that smelled of damp stone and something metallic, listening as voices passed overhead discussing sermons and schedules with a casual cruelty that chilled Ellen more than any threat. They escaped unseen, but the town sensed the shift almost immediately, as if Cedar Creek itself had a nervous system attuned to disturbance, and the following days brought a tightening of the social fabric around Ellen, conversations stopping when she entered rooms, invitations withdraw, smiles sharpening into assessments, and she realized that the town did not yet know what she had but suspected enough to prepare. The groundskeeper disappeared 3 days later, his absence explained with the same hollow ease that had concealed so many others, and Ellen felt the guilt settle in her chest like a stone, a reminder that action had consequences that could not be distributed evenly. And yet his disappearance also hardened her resolve, because silence would not bring him back, and delay would only add to the ledger of losses. With the evidence she had gathered, Ellen began to reach beyond Cedar Creek, sending copies through discreet channels to distant contacts, understanding that distance was her only ally, and as she did so, she became acutely aware of how the town's self-image depended on forgetting, on the ritual erasure of inconvenient truths, and how violently it reacted when that forgetting was threatened. She was confronted one evening by members of the church council who spoke softly of concern and reputation, framing her investigation as a misunderstanding that endangered communal harmony, and when she refused to recant, they reminded her of the power they held over her employment, her safety, her very presence. And in that moment, Ellen saw that the church's greatest weapon was not fear, but the promise of belonging withdrawn, the threat of isolation in a place where survival depended on mutual recognition. She left that meeting shaken but unbroken, aware that the line between witness and victim had narrowed, and as she packed her belongings under cover of night, she understood that leaving Cedar Creek would not mean abandoning the fight, but transforming it, carrying the story beyond the reach of those who had buried it. And as she stepped onto the road with her bag and her burden, she knew that the town would continue its rituals in her absence, but it would do so under the shadow of a truth already moving outward, gathering momentum, because secrets sustained by community collapse most violently when exposed to a wider world that refuses to share the same silence. Ellen's departure did not end the story, but altered its gravity, because once she crossed beyond Cedar Creek, the silence that had protected the town began to thin, stretching until it could no longer bear the weight placed upon it, and as she traveled from one distant contact to another, always careful to avoid patterns, she discovered how deeply the church's influence reached, how its name opened doors and closed them with equal efficiency, and how many people preferred the comfort of disbelief to the labor of confrontation. Yet the documents she carried possessed a stubborn authority that rumors lacked, ledgers written in careful hands, dates and initials that refused to remain abstract, and when she finally found a journalist willing to listen, a man already familiar with the way institutions swallowed scandal and spat out scapegoats, the story began to take on a shape that could survive scrutiny, though not without resistance. The first article appeared cautiously, framed as an investigation into irregularities rather than an accusation, but Cedar Creek reacted with a fury that surprised even Ellen, denouncing the report as an attack on faith itself, organizing sermons that equated questioning with heresy, and mobilizing social networks to discredit both the journalist and his source, painting Ellen as unstable, ambitious, morally suspect, and this response revealed what the church feared most, not the exposure of individual crimes, but the unraveling of the narrative that sustained its authority. As more pieces followed, each corroborated by fragments of evidence Ellen had gathered or by witnesses emboldened by distance, the pattern became undeniable, and towns neighboring Cedar Creek began to recognize echoes of their own buried losses in the details described, names that had been mourned briefly and then forgotten resurfacing with new conte. XT, and this recognition spread quietly at first, like a bruise blooming beneath skin, until it reached a point where denial required active effort rather than passive neglect.
Proceedings moved slowly, hampered by jurisdictional confusion and deliberate obstruction.
But the mere initiation of inquiry disrupted the church's internal cohesion, members turning on one another in whispered accusations as the certainty of collective protection eroded, and Ellen, watching from afar, felt a complicated mixture of vindication and sorrow, because every confirmation meant another truth validated at the cost of acknowledging how long it had been ignored.
Journalists uncovered financial records that mirrored the basement ledgers, transactions masked as donations or educational expenses, revealing a network that monetized trust with ruthless efficiency. And as these findings reached a broader audience, the story shifted from local scandal to national reckoning, forcing readers to confront the uncomfortable reality that such systems thrived not because of isolated malice, but because of widespread complicity. Survivors began to come forward, some anonymously, others with names that trembled but did not retreat, and their testimonies filled gaps Ellen's documents could not, humanizing the numbers without resorting to spectacle, and it became clear that the church's greatest crime was not only what it had done, but what it had normalized, teaching generations to equate obedience with virtue and silence with loyalty. Cedar Creek attempted reform too late, dismissing a handful of leaders in gestures designed to absorb outrage without addressing its roots. But these moves satisfied no one, exposing instead the depth of rot beneath the surface. And when authorities finally entered the church with warrants, the image of locked doors forced open resonated far beyond the town, a visual metaphor for secrets pried loose by persistence rather than grace. Ellen returned briefly to testify, stepping once more into the streets where her curiosity had first been treated as threat, and though she was greeted with stares that ranged from hatred to gratitude, she felt a strange calm, aware that whatever verdicts followed, the town could no longer pretend ignorance, and that alone constituted a kind of justice. The trials that followed were uneven, some charges dismissed, others upheld, sentences lighter than many hoped, heavier than the church expected, and the outcome satisfied no one completely, yet the process altered Cedar Creek irrevocably, attendance dwindling, the once unchallenged authority fractured into factions arguing over legacy and responsibility. Ellen watched this from a distance, understanding that accountability is rarely symmetrical with harm, but also recognizing that the exposure had prevented the cycle from continuing unchecked, and as she resumed her life elsewhere, she carried with her the knowledge that truth, once spoken, does not resolve neatly, that it lingers, demanding reckoning long after headlines fade. Years later, when Cedar Creek attempted to rebrand itself, erasing references to its past, the story resurfaced again, because memory, unlike institutions, does not obey commands to forget, and Ellen realized then that the real work of her actions lay not in the trials or articles, but in the permanent alteration of what could be denied, ensuring that whenever someone asked why 50 children never came home, there would be an answer, incomplete and imperfect, but spoken aloud, breaking the pattern of silence that had once allowed evil to pass for order. The trials did not close the wound so much as expose how deep it ran, and in the months that followed, Cedar Creek existed in a strange half-life where the past and present overlapped uncomfortably, because every routine act, Sunday bells, school recitals, charity drives, now carried the echo of what had been hidden beneath them, and people who had once trusted without question began to examine their memories with forensic intensity, replaying conversations, gestures, moments that had seemed ordinary but now appeared charged with implication,
and this collective re-examination unsettled the town far more than any single verdict ever could. Families who had lost children decades earlier found themselves pulled back into grief they had been taught to compartmentalize, grief that had never resolved but merely calcified, and as they spoke openly for the first time, they discovered how systematically their pain had been managed, redirected into prayer meetings and platitudes, how questions had been answered with spiritual abstractions designed to soothe without clarifying, and this realization bred a quiet fury that did not dissipate when the cameras left. The church attempted to restore normalcy through ritual, emphasizing forgiveness and unity, but these words rang hollow against the evidence of deliberate concealment, and sermons that once inspired comfort now sounded rehearsed, defensive, carefully calibrated to avoid specificity, prompting many congregants to walk out not in anger but in weary disillusionment. Ellen, following these developments from afar, understood that the real reckoning was unfolding not in courtrooms but in kitchens and living rooms, where families argued late into the night about responsibility and belief, where children asked questions their parents struggled to answer honestly, and where silence, once a default, now felt like a conscious choice rather than an inevitability. Investigators continued to uncover secondary layers of misconduct, teachers reassigned quietly, records altered with practiced ease, community leaders who had suspected something yet chosen not to pursue it, and each revelation reinforced the same pattern, that the system's endurance depended less on monstrous individuals than on the accumulation of small acts of avoidance, and this understanding proved harder to process than the idea of a single villain. As memorials were proposed for the missing children, debates erupted over wording and placement, exposing lingering tensions about how much truth the town was willing to inscribe into public space, and though compromises were reached, the process itself marked a shift, because the names, once suppressed, were now spoken openly, carved into stone rather than whispered in corners. Some families moved away, unable to remain in a place that now felt haunted by recognition, while others stayed precisely because leaving felt like surrendering the hard-won acknowledgement they had fought for, and Cedar Creek's population thinned unevenly, reshaped by the fallout of exposure. Ellen returned again briefly, not as a witness this time but as an observer, walking past the church whose basement had altered the trajectory of her life, noting how its doors remained open yet hesitant, as if unsure who was still welcome, and she felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest, a recognition that confronting such histories is less about closure than about refusing erasure. The town's story began to circulate in academic circles and training seminars as a case study in institutional failure, and while this brought a strange form of validation, it also risked abstraction, reducing lived pain to bullet points and lessons learned, and Ellen resisted this flattening by continuing to speak publicly, emphasizing the human cost behind every procedural lapse, insisting that vigilance is not an abstract principle but a daily practice sustained by discomfort. Over time, Cedar Creek's name faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals elsewhere, yet the pattern it revealed proved depressingly familiar, and Ellen watched these cycles repeat with a growing sense of urgency, recognizing how quickly attention moves on and how easily institutions count on that fatigue. The children who never came home remained central in her thoughts, not as symbols but as individuals whose absence had shaped countless lives, and she understood that honoring them required more than remembrance. It required sustained skepticism toward narratives that demand trust without transparency. As years passed, Ellen's role shifted from investigator to mentor, guiding others who sensed something wrong within their own communities, encouraging them to document, to persist, to trust the quiet insistence of unease. And though this work carried its own exhaustion, it also offered a measure of meaning, a way to transform one town's tragedy into a broader refusal to accept silence as safety. Cedar Creek itself never fully recovered its former cohesion, but perhaps that was inevitable, because cohesion built on denial cannot survive truth intact, and in its fractured state, the town became something else, less unified, more wary, and paradoxically, more honest. Ellen understood that this honesty, however painful, represented the only viable foundation for anything resembling redemption, and as she reflected on the path that had brought her there, she recognized that the most unsettling lesson was also the most necessary, that evil often thrives not through overt cruelty, but through the quiet agreement to look away, and that confronting it requires not heroism, but persistence, a willingness to keep asking questions long after the answers cease to be comforting. As the years pressed forward and the immediate shock of revelation receded into a more durable awareness, Cedar Creek entered a phase that outsiders mistook for healing, but that residents understood as something far more complicated, because healing implied an endpoint, and what they were experiencing was a permanent recalibration of how trust functioned in their lives, a slow, grinding adjustment in which every familiar institution was re-evaluated, not for what it claimed to be, but for what it had demonstrably done. And this shift manifested in subtle but pervasive ways that altered the town's rhythm. Attendance at civic meetings increased, not out of renewed faith but out of vigilance, with residents sitting straighter, asking sharper questions, demanding documentation where once a handshake or a clerical collar would have sufficed. And though this scrutiny sometimes created friction, it also marked a collective refusal to outsource moral responsibility again. Schools revised their policies publicly, inviting parental oversight and external audits, and while these measures were framed as progressive reforms, everyone knew they were reactive, born of a recognition that closed systems breed abuse when left unchallenged, and this knowledge hung in the air like a persistent draft that prevented any return to complacency. The church itself attempted a rebranding of sorts, replacing leadership, repainting walls, introducing new programming that emphasized transparency and safeguarding. Yet the building could not shed its history, and every improvement felt provisional, as if awaiting some future test it might or might not pass, and congregants who returned did so cautiously, often sitting near exits, often leaving immediately after services without the lingering conversations that once defined communal worship. Ellen, observing these developments from a distance, felt an uneasy blend of validation and sorrow, because the changes she had fought for were real, yet they existed only because of irreversible loss, and she carried the weight of that trade-off heavily, understanding that progress extracted through tragedy never feels like a clean victory. Her correspondence with families from Cedar Creek grew more sporadic but more reflective, shifting from urgent updates to long letters that wrestled with meaning, responsibility, and the question of how to live in a world where institutions can betray so thoroughly, and these exchanges revealed a shared struggle to reconcile the desire for normalcy with the necessity of remembrance. Memorial anniversaries became focal points for this tension, drawing modes. Tea crowds who gathered not out of obligation but out of a quiet commitment to presence, standing together in silence that felt deliberate rather than imposed. And in those moments, the town articulated a new kind of unity, one forged not by shared belief, but by shared acknowledgement of harm. Meanwhile, the broader cultural response to Cedar Creek's story evolved, with documentaries and books framing it within a lineage of institutional abuse. And while this contextualization helped dismantle the myth of exceptionality, it also risked diluting the specificity of the children's lives, turning them into case numbers within a grim continuum, and Ellen resisted this abstraction whenever she spoke publicly, insisting on names, dates, personal details that anchored the narrative in human reality. She emphasized that the most dangerous aspect of such histories is not their horror but their familiarity, the way patterns repeat because each generation believes itself immune. And this insistence resonated with audiences who recognized echoes in their own communities, prompting a steady stream of messages from individuals grappling with suspicions they had long suppressed. Ellen encouraged them not with dramatic calls to action, but with methodical guidance, advising documentation, consultation, patience, and above all, an understanding that resistance often begins with isolation and doubt, and that perseverance requires support structures deliberately cultivated. This mentorship expanded her sense of purpose while also intensifying her awareness of scale, because each new story suggested countless others still hidden, and she learned to manage this awareness without succumbing to paralysis by focusing on the tangible impact of incremental change. Cedar Creek, for its part, continued to navigate its altered identity, attracting a trickle of researchers and journalists who treated the town as a site of cautionary significance, and while some residents resented this attention, others recognized its utility, understanding that visibility, however uncomfortable, served as a deterrent against future erasure. Economic shifts followed, subtle but real, as institutions associated with the scandal lost patronage, and new businesses emerged that marketed themselves on ethical transparency, signaling a consumer-driven response to moral failure that reflected broader societal trends. Younger generations in Cedar Creek grew up with a version of the story that was neither whispered nor sensationalized, but integrated into local history curricula, taught with an emphasis on critical thinking and civic responsibility, and this educational approach, though contested initially, gradually became a point of cautious pride, a recognition that confronting darkness openly offered a better inheritance than silence ever could. Ellen visited one such classroom during a rare return to the town, listening as students asked incisive questions about accountability and prevention, and she felt a restrained hope stir, not because the past had been redeemed, but because its lessons were being treated as living obligations rather than static warnings. Yet even as these constructive developments unfolded, the emotional residue of the tragedy persisted in quieter ways, surfacing in moments of disproportionate anger or inexplicable withdrawal, reminding everyone that trauma does not resolve neatly but lingers, shaping behavior long after narratives settle. Ellen understood this intimately, recognizing similar patterns within herself, moments when vigilance tipped into suspicion, when the labor of care felt exhausting, and she learned to acknowledge these responses without letting them dictate her actions, a balance she encouraged others to seek as well. The legacy of Cedar Creek thus crystallized not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing dialogue about power, trust, and the cost of inattention, a dialogue that refused the comfort of finality, and as Ellen continued her work, she carried with her the understanding that the most meaningful outcomes often unfold slowly, invisibly, in the cumulative effect of altered expectations and sustained questioning. In this sense, the town's ordeal contributed to a broader cultural shift, subtle but significant, toward a recognition that safeguarding is not a static policy but an active practice, one that demands participation rather than deference. And while this realization offered no solace to those who had lost children, it represented a refusal to allow that loss to vanish into history unexamined. Ellen's role within this evolving landscape remained deliberately understated, because she had learned that hero narratives obscure collective responsibility, and instead she framed her contributions as part of a wider continuum of people who chose to notice, to document, to persist, and in doing so, she honored the memory of the children, not by claiming resolution, but by sustaining the discomfort that keeps vigilance alive. As the final years unfolded and the story of Cedar Creek settled into its long afterlife, what became most unsettling was not the catalogue of crimes already exposed, but the quiet realization of how easily time itself tries to soften sharp truths, how memory erodes not through denial alone but through exhaustion, and it was this slow fading that Ellen understood as the last and most dangerous enemy. Long after court records were archived, after journalists moved on, after the church building was sold and repurposed into something innocuous with fresh paint and neutral signage, the real struggle became resisting the temptation to let the past become abstract, a lesson learned rather than a wound still capable of reopening. Ellen watched this process with a scholar's precision and a survivor's dread, noticing how language changed first, how people began saying the incident instead of the children, how discussions shifted toward institutional reform metrics rather than the lived terror of small hands pounding on locked doors in the dark. She understood that this shift was not malicious but human, a psychological reflex to distance oneself from unbearable detail. Yet she also knew that every layer of abstraction increased the risk of repetition elsewhere, because systems fail most catastrophically when empathy is replaced by procedure alone. In response, she began compiling what she called the living record, a body of work that resisted neat conclusions, composed of testimonies, fragments of letters, remembered conversations, and unanswered questions, deliberately arranged without a comforting narrative arc, forcing readers to sit with ambiguity and discomfort rather than emerge feeling cleansed or resolved. This work circulated quietly at first among educators, advocates, and archivists, but over time it gained traction precisely because it refused spectacle, because it treated the story not as horror entertainment, but as a moral reckoning that demanded sustained attention. Cedar Creek itself continued to exist in this liminal state, neither fully defined by its past nor free from it, a town where everyday life carried an undercurrent of awareness that shaped behavior in subtle ways, from the way adults lingered longer at school gates to the way community leaders rotated responsibilities rather than consolidating authority, practices that might have seemed excessive to outsiders but felt necessary to those who remembered how easily trust had once been weaponized. New families moved in, drawn by affordable land and the promise of renewal, and while some arrived unaware of the town's history, most learned it quickly, because residents no longer treated it as a shameful secret but as essential context, an unspoken contract that anyone who stayed would participate in vigilance rather than ignorance. Ellen's final public address on Cedar Creek came years later at a small, untelevised gathering marking an anniversary that no calendar officially reckoned. And she spoke not about the perpetrators, whose names she refused to repeat, but about the ordinary decisions that enable extraordinary harm, the moments when silence feels polite, when doubt feels rude, when questioning authority feels disruptive, and she reminded those listening that evil rarely announces itself with spectacle, preferring instead to cloak itself in routine, respectability, and appeals to unity. Her voice, steady but unadorned, carried the weight of lived experience rather than rhetoric, and when she finished, there was no applause, only a prolonged quiet that felt appropriate, a collective acknowledgement that some truths are not meant to be consumed but carried. After that night, Ellen withdrew further from public life, content to let the work continue without her at its center, understanding that sustainable change depends on diffusion rather than leadership icons, and she spent her remaining years mentoring quietly, writing meticulously, and maintaining correspondence with those who found themselves standing at the beginning of their own Cedar Creek moments, uncertain, afraid, but unwilling to look away. The children's names, once nearly erased, became fixtures in local memory not through grand monuments, but through repetition, spoken aloud in classrooms, inscribed in modest plaques, referenced in policy discussions as a reminder of why safeguards existed at all, and this integration of remembrance into daily function represented perhaps the most meaningful outcome of the tragedy, a refusal to relegate loss to ceremonial occasions alone. Yet even with these measures, Ellen remained clear-eyed about the limits of prevention, acknowledging that no system can guarantee safety, that vigilance is an ongoing practice rather than a permanent state, and that the goal is not to create a world without risk, but a culture where risk is confronted honestly rather than hidden behind reverence or fear. In her final writings, she returned often to the idea of responsibility as a shared burden, arguing that the most profound injustice of Cedar Creek was not only what happened, but how many people, consciously or not, surrendered their agency to institutions they wanted to believe in, and she urged future readers to resist that surrender, to remain uncomfortable when necessary, to ask questions even when answers threaten cohesion. As time continued its relentless march, Cedar Creek's story found its place among countless others, distinct yet connected, a reminder that history's darkest chapters are rarely isolated anomalies, but part of a larger pattern that repeats wherever power goes unexamined. And so the story does not end with closure, because closure implies completion, and this is not a tale that can be neatly concluded. It ends instead with a challenge, implicit and enduring, asking each listener not what they would have done then, but what they are doing now, in their own communities, their own institutions, their own moments of uneasy silence. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you rather than entertained you, then let that discomfort serve a purpose. Subscribe to Born into Darkness, hit the bell icon so you don't miss the stories history tried to bury, and leave a comment telling us how deeply this story affected you, because remembrance is not passive, and the darkest truths only lose their power when they are faced, spoken, and carried forward by those unwilling to forget.